Okay, so I'm in charge of timing myself. This could be fun. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, first of all, Kim gave a great overview on some of the problems associated with atmospheric aerosols, and I thank her for that. Today I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been involved in, both in my own lab and also with CASE, the Center for Aerosol Impacts on Climate and the Environment. And I'm going to also discuss not only the chemical composition of these individual aerosol particles, but also some of the chemistry that can occur in the atmosphere, the heterogeneous chemistry that can occur, and using, again, these single particle techniques to better understand that chemistry. So Kim gave a great overview about the complexities and challenges of studying atmospheric aerosols. If we think as chemists as the atmosphere as a huge chemical reactor, there's a lot going on. We have gases, both inorganic and organics. We have small particles, primary particles, those such as mineral dust and sea spray, as well as secondary particles that form from the condensation of gases that are also prevalent in the atmosphere. And as these particles are formed, or as they come out as primary particles, they undergo chemistry, and so you really get these very complex mixtures. And so I will say it's a mess. And so what we've tried to do in my lab is take an approach by trying to design these laboratory studies to better understand what kind of chemistry is going on in the atmosphere, what kind of transformations these particles are undergoing, and can we say something about the global impacts based on these laboratory studies. And like today, because of the nature of this symposium, I'm going to focus on our single particle analysis and how that has moved us forward in understanding atmospheric aerosols. Kim and I wrote this review article with Courtney Hatch, who's a professor now, and we wrote this in, I guess it was in 2008, I think, and we just sort of put this little cartoon in the speaker, and I have to say right over here, in our paper, it says sea salt. But we don't want to say that anymore because, as Kim pointed out, it's not just salts coming out of the atmosphere, out of the ocean. It's a lot more complicated. So I have to patch it up and put sea spray. I don't think we have to write an erratum on fixing this cartoon, but anyway, I just wanted to show you how our thinking has evolved in being in the center and really thinking about what's going on an individual particle level. So again, if you really want to understand the role of atmospheric aerosols, it really requires an integrated approach. Kim told us about her great field studies that have been going on for 20 years, a little bit about laboratory studies. I'll talk about this some more. And then modeling analysis is also an important component of understanding atmospheric chemistry and climate. There's a lot of modeling that needs to be done so you can do projections, see what makes sense in terms of changing, regulating some chemicals versus others. But what I will tell you is that this whole idea of aerosol complexity is treated quite differently between models, laboratory studies, and what's seen in the field. If you talk to modelers, oftentimes in the model, their model simply says, aerosols do this. And they'll have like one line in the code, a chemical reaction, ability to nucleate a cloud, something very, very simple. Aerosols do this. Yet you just heard from Kim, there's many, many, many types of aerosols. So putting it in that very simplistic way is obviously, especially from a chemistry perspective, not very satisfying. So in the laboratory, again, we often use model systems in order to understand different types of atmospheric aerosols. So maybe we build complexity from this, but we may not be quite here. So these different approaches, which are all needed, field lab and modeling, to understand atmospheric aerosols, are coming at it from very different directions. And so some of the things that the center is trying to do, and I've tried to do in my lab, is trying to integrate these, if you will, in a way that we can start to make sense of what's going on. So I'll talk about our work. I'm going to give you case studies, things that we've learned about specific types of aerosols. We've been involved in studies of mineral dust. Mineral dust is everywhere. That's what we heard from Kim. My colleague Greg Carmichael will tell you dust is everywhere. But here's some specific types of dust storms from China. It happens about every year. Here's a dust storm off the coast of Africa, and these get transported fairly long distances to the U.S. You'll have, in particular, a hazy day in the state of Washington because of a dust storm that happened in an Asian desert 7 to 10 days earlier. Here's a dust storm. I don't know, people living over here, I would just start running. I don't know where I would go, but it's pretty large dust storm happening here, and this happens all the time. Now, like I said, when you talk about mineral dust aerosol to a modeler, they just treat it as a single entity aerosol with a optical constants and chemical properties given by a single value. But if you think about mineral dust, actually from a chemistry perspective, it's much more complex, much richer than that description. And so that's where things started. And in our group, we really want to change the thinking about this. Okay, so what we did was we designed laboratory studies to better understand the properties and chemistry of mineral dust aerosol. We started by looking at the components of mineral dust and trying to tease out, which particles were important with which reactions, focusing on this particle heterogeneity, if you will, that mineral dust aerosol cannot be treated as a single entity aerosol. We've looked at clays, oxides, carbonates have been the ones that we focused a lot of our attention on. But we also look at well-characterized authentic dust samples or dust sources, which are more complex mixtures. And so when we go to these complex mixtures, the single particle analysis is a very important method of analysis that we use in our studies. And then again, the other thing we're going to look at is how atmospheric processing of mineral dust through heterogeneous and multi-phase chemistry can change these particles. So you can start off with a mineral dust particle. It can interact with all those gases and even other particles in the atmosphere. There could be no interaction. This would be considered an external mixture of particles, each one being a little bit different. You may get coatings around the particle. You may get chemistry and then some sort of phase segregation. I think, Alan, you might be touching upon that in your talk. And these atmospheric processes include everything from aqueous phase chemistry to just simply gas surface interactions. You typically have a water on the surface of these particles. That's something my group has studied quite a bit, the role of adsorbed water in the surface chemistry of dust particles. But these are the different types of chemistry that can occur. So again, we've looked at a number of different techniques. We typically look at substrate deposited particles. So you heard from Kim and her work. She's doing online analysis and all the beautiful work that she's done in her lab. We tend to deposit these particles on a substrate so that we can study them we're using a number of different techniques, electron microscopy, atomic force microscopy, and more recently we've been doing a lot of Raman spectroscopy. Okay, so we did some work early on, and I'm just going to show you this as an example. Here we were working with Alex Laskin using a scanning electron microscopy to simply look at the reaction of gas phase nitric acid with different components of mineral dust particles. And so here we're just zooming in on a picture of calcium carbonate particles or calcite. Here we're zooming in on a quartz particle, silicon dioxide. And what we did was we exposed these different types of particles to nitric acid vapor at different relative humidities. In the case of the quartz particle, just viewing this, we see very little has happened, as indicated by these two images, before and after reaction. But in the case of the calcium carbonate, we see very significant changes. Basically, a solid particle starts to look like a liquid droplet due to the heterogeneous chemistry of nitric acid in the gas phase. We've studied this reaction in great detail, and I don't want to talk too much about it, except to say that we were able to use different techniques, including infrared spectroscopy, to show we were making calcium nitrate, which forms a deliquescent layer and was able to pick up water. And we were able to monitor that chemistry in great detail. As Kim talked about, the importance of soluble species on the surface can affect cloud condensation nuclei activity, and we've shown that this reaction can affect that activity. In the case of the quartz, what we found when we did our IR studies is you get nitric acid just molecularly very weakly absorbing on the particle surface, and that reaction is a reversible reaction, and so we were able to really nail down sort of the chemistry, both from a microscopic single particle level and then looking at the chemistry in more detail with some bulk powders. What's interesting is that these particles show a change in morphology upon reaction with nitric acid, and what I want to say is that this morphology change gives you a way to potentially quantify how in the atmosphere particles can undergo chemistry. And you can quantify that using the two-dimensional circularity of the particle. So instead of just saying it looks like it changed or that sort of thing, we now have a quantitative way to determine that. So we're looking at a two-dimensional projection of the particle. The circularity is quantified by 4 pi a over p squared, where a is the two-dimensional projected area and p is the parameter. And here's just examples of different types of shapes that one has and the different types of circularities that you get. So a circle or a sphere in 3 dimension has a circularity factor of 1. So you see if a particle changes from a square to a circle, you get an increase in that circularity parameter. And again, we're using it now as a quantitative measure of change in morphology as opposed to just saying something has changed. And then here we're looking at the heterogeneous chemistry of mineral dust. We're looking at a more complex system. This is a China low sample. Here I've highlighted 3 particles, A, B, and C. A is an aluminum silicate, B is calcium carbonate, and C is a quartz particle. And again, reaction with nitric acid, we only see that particle B has undergone morphology changes. And again, in this complex mixture, what we saw with some of the single components, we can explain readily from the chemistry I just mentioned a moment ago. So more recently, we've been looking at reactions of organic acids with components with mineral dust aerosol, and that's not a question, that's actually something we're doing. And the question was, in this particular study, we wanted to look at the effect of coatings on the optical properties. How can we understand the light scattering and FTIR extinction spectra of mineral dust aerosol? Again, these dust particles are treated very simply in models. Me theory is often used to analyze dust in remote sensing. Me theory is a theory that assumes a spherical particle. I showed you already that maybe the processed calcium carbonate particle is spherical, but dust in itself is really not very spherical at all. And so we wanted to look at the impact of coatings. We've already done a lot of studies about shape effects with Paul Kleiber and Mark Young, but we wanted to look at the effects of coatings when you had things like acetic oxalic acid and humic acid. And again, I'm showing you selective results here, focusing on some of the single particle work. So here we did some work, it was basically cloud processing, so it was aqueous phase chemistry that we were looking at of organic acids, acetic, oxalic, and humic acid with quartz. So here's some of our quartz particles that have not been reacted with these acids, and here, for example, is the humic acid reacted particle. What you can see, if we go back to our circularity parameter, this has a circularity less than 1. These are irregularly shaped particles. These particles start to tend towards circularity of about 1. So we can look at this, and you can see most likely that these are coatings around that particle. In the case of oxalic acid, we saw that we generated an external mixture. These rods are actually rods of oxalic acid, and then we have quartz. So those didn't react very well, and again, acetic acid was very similar to nitric acid. It was just weakly absorbing on the surface in a reversible fashion. What we're doing now, and these are some of our first images, and we actually have done this a lot better more recently, is we're using micro-Raman spectroscopy to provide chemical maps of reacted and coated particles. And in this particular case, what we're focusing on up here is the reaction of calcium carbonate with oxalic and with acetic acid. And what we're able to see is that we end up getting phase segregation. So now these are Raman spectra of these of calcium carbonate versus calcium oxalate, and then here's the reacted sample in the middle. Here is calcium carbonate, calcium acetate, and the reacted sample in the middle. So we get the spectrum, we can see bits of each of these, and so this undergoes chemistry, but the point I want to make here is we see this phase segregation between these two different, the reacted species. Whereas in the case of humic, just like that microscopy image showed, we in fact get coatings on calcite, quartz, and kaolinite. So humic acid is a very complex macrocyclic type of many macrocycles stuck together system, a very complex large system that easily coats, high molecular weight system that coats these particles. And we can see that in our maps. So again, we're starting to get information about composition, but also about some of the impacts of spatial heterogeneity in these reactions. Okay, another example that I want to talk about is the example of iron-containing mineral dust. There's a lot of interest in iron deposition into the oceans and bioavailable iron. So there's regions of the ocean where ocean life, phytoplankton blooms, so forth and so on, are limited by the amount of iron. So they're limiting regions of iron in the oceans, and dust is thought to be one of the sources. So dust from Africa, for example, can deposit into the Atlantic Ocean. That provides the iron for a bloom or for biomass formation. And so when we started these studies, in any model, iron was just assumed to be in the form of hematite. So here it was just assumed that all sources of iron were hematite, but we suggested that iron speciation and the mineralogy was going to be much more rich than that and much more important in understanding the dissolution. And the other point is that in the atmosphere, again, these particles undergo reactions, oftentimes with acids, and so we wanted to look at the dissolution of these iron-containing particles with acidic gases or in acidic solutions. So again, here we looked at some authentic complex dust samples from many different parts of the world, China, Africa, Middle East. We had some a standard that people use for mineral dust. It's called Arizona road dust. We can do we can measure many different particles, get an elemental map of percentage, atomic percentage of these, and you can see that we have different numbers for these different dust samples that we had. And then the important point here is that elemental maps of these particles again show heterogeneity. You can have a dust particle that has no iron, so here we have the iron, we have nothing there. Here we have a dust particle shown in the middle, which has iron, but it's also co-located with silicon and aluminum. So this is iron in an aluminum silicate clay. Here we have a China-Los particle, which has high iron. Maybe that is in fact iron, hematite, iron oxide, but clearly it's more than just one type of iron in the particles, and they're distributed within the particles. So what we did was we did a study where we looked at iron dissolution at low pH, and we looked at it in a few different, that should say 5 different dust samples, and we measured dissolved iron 2, dissolved iron 3, dissolved iron at low pH, trying to simulate some of the low pH environments that can occur due to the absorption of these acidic acids. And what we said was what we say is from our data, if we just tried to normalize these results or understand these results in terms of very simple physical descriptors of surface area or percent iron, which is often what was typically done, we really couldn't make any sense of the data. Nothing correlated. What we had to do was go to sort of that next step in understanding the iron chemistry through more spectroscopic and single particle analysis. So our colleague Michelle Shearer does Mossbauer spectroscopy. She was able to identify iron 3, iron 2, and aluminum silicates, as well as iron 3 and oxides such as hematite. That was really helpful in trying to sort of narrow down some of the speciation of the iron. And then we worked with Alex Laskin to start looking at the maps, the amount of aluminum, silicon, and iron. These are ternary plots. And what came out of our data analysis is that iron 2 and iron 3 substituted in aluminum silicate clays was really the most important in terms of the bioavailable, the most soluble iron. So again, combining a spectroscopy with single particle analysis was hugely helpful. Okay. And now some of the new studies that we're doing suggest, our group and others, that anthropogenic sources of iron-containing dust are also important. And I just show here some data from Andy Alt. There was a field study looking at iron in coarse particles in Cleveland, Ohio. And what they found was there are a lot of different types of iron-containing particles. We have mineral dust, and we also have things like fly ash. And what was interesting about this study that was published in ESNT in 2012, it actually took over a 3-year time period. And during that 3-year time period, there was the recession, and they actually shut down some of the manufacturing, some of the industry in the area, and they definitely detected changes in the atmospheric aerosol due to that shutting down some of that industry. In particular, there was much less fly ash, mineral dust stayed about the same, and we were able to we did an experiment, if you will, out in the field, because by accident there was a recession and there was a shutdown of industry, and we were able to capture that by our studies. And then we've also done some work looking at the dissolution of these, some coal fly ash with Hai-Han Chen, Jonas Baltrasatis, and Alex Laskin. Okay, so that's what I wanted to tell you about mineral dust, which has been something we've been studying for quite a while. And I don't have to say in introductory form too much about sea spray aerosol after that excellent introduction that Kim gave. But basically, going back to that whole idea that sea spray aerosol is also treated very simply as a single entity aerosol, oftentimes just sodium chloride. Is something that's out there and that people are doing. But as she began to tell you, I'll tell you a little bit more. It's much more complex mixture of inorganic, organic, and biological components. And so how best to study environmentally relevant sea spray aerosol? And that was a question that we heard just a moment ago in the lab. Okay, so what was done, constructed a model ocean atmosphere. Kim and Tim Bertram really led that effort. I applaud them for their really hard work, the 15 months it took to put this all together, and producing waves in a real fashion by producing sea spray by breaking waves. And so that led us to the Center for Aerosol Impacts on Climate and the Environment, which, like I said, Kim has already introduced, but if you weren't here, it's a new center that's located at the University of California, San Diego, but has a lot of other partners, including the University of Iowa. I'm working with Betsy Stone and Alexei Tavansky there to better understand aerosols. So Kim read you the mission statement. Let me sort of go now into some of the new things that we've learned from this center. Well, one of the things that we're doing in the center is we're really trying to integrate many experimental methods. Kim showed you beautiful mass spectra. That gives you one set of information. Somebody else will show you electron micrographs. That gives you another set of information. Somebody might do some frequency generation to look at the surface, or Raman spectroscopy, or XPS. And I know a lot of you are analytical chemists, and all these techniques are really biased. They're biased in terms of what they can see. They're biased in terms of what size range they work. And so getting the full picture of what comes out of the ocean really requires this integration of methods. And that's something that we tried hard to do in phase 1. And I'll show you where it led us. So what we did was we integrated a number of different methods, and what we were able to do was we were able to basically give you some more idea of the chemical composition of sea spray aerosol from 30 nanometers to 3 micrometers. And what we tried to do was put these different types of particles, even though on an individual particle level there's differences, but we tried to at least get a fuller picture besides just being sodium chloride in this first stab at understanding these particles. And so what we did was we integrated the aerosol time of flight mass spectrometry data with transmission electron microscopy, energy dispersive X-ray analysis. We had a glue that stuck this all together called STIXM, scanning transmission X-ray microscopy that was done by Ryan Moffett, and here's some of his data. And what we found is that for the larger particles, some of these look really like sodium chloride, just that people had expected. But as you get to smaller size, but even at larger size, there's other things. Here in red is biological particles. So here is the legend over here, biological particles. There's another another group of particles that we call sea salt with organic carbon, so they have some coatings around that. And then we have some particles which do not have a sodium chloride core at all. And here's just one image, and we've been collecting more, and Kim showed you the cryo-TEM of some of these that occur at smaller size. So we really had to work hard to integrate these methods. A little kludgy, if you will, but I think that we were able to get to start of a story of how the chemistry and composition of these particles change as a function of size. So a lot is coming out of the ocean, and it's very, very much more complex than just a simple sodium chloride description. Another thing that we learned is that individual particles have a range of internal structures. These two particles have sodium chloride at the core. This one might be pure sodium chloride, but maybe it has a little ring of organic material around it. But then here we have another particle, almost the same size, but we have a very small sodium chloride core and a much thicker organic coating. How will these behave in the atmosphere with respect to heterogeneous chemistry, their optical properties, how they nucleate clouds? It's not going to be the same, we think. So those are some of the questions that we're asking in the center. We can use Raman spectroscopy, looking at micro-Raman, looking at individual particles. We get beautiful spectra showing that there's hydrocarbons associated with these particles. I've blew up this region in the CH stretching region to show we sort of get this very flat top structure. We try to do some spectral analysis to look at different components. So this looks like it's a multi-component system. We're working more on this right now in phase 2. So what we did, if you look at that spectrum again, it looked like it was a lot of aliphatic hydrocarbons, CH bonds associated with it. We measured some single components. Palmitic acid is something that we're focusing our attention on. It seems to be in a lot of the particles, as well as lipopolysaccharides. When we sort of do a spectral mixing of these different amounts, we start to get that flat top structure. And so we do think there's multiple components of organics, but we're trying to narrow that down. Also, now as we've been able to control the bloom, we've been able to see changes in the organic content as a function of that bloom that Kim was talking about, and we're analyzing that time dependence in terms of days in much more detail at the single particle level now. Some of the chemistry we were able to do of these now nascent sea spray aerosol particles was part of that 2011 experiment working with Tim Bertram's group, who put together the flow tube reactor. We looked at the heterogeneous chemistry of nitric acid with these particles. We looked at them. We looked at the particles, what we call in the surface area mode regime, which is around 1 micron or so. And what we learned is this. We collected these particles, and what we saw was the expected chemistry. The expected chemistry goes something like this. If you have unreacted particles, you'll see chlorine in the 2p region for chlorine in the XPS spectrum. And then upon reaction, you lose that chlorine and you get a nitrate. So basically, this is the reaction of sodium chloride plus nitric acid to give sodium nitrate, a very well-known chemistry. And so this fits the well-known thoughts about that chemistry. We can even see some particles that had been reacted, and what we find for the reacted particles, we in fact form sodium nitrate, and you get the expected Raman peaks that you would for that particular product. But then if you look at many particles, you start to see that there's a wide range of reactivities when we look at it with micro-Raman spectroscopy and when we look at it on an individual particle level. So here we have a set of particles, so there's about 20 spectra all lined up on one another, which we say exhibit high reactivity. So pretty much we see all those nitrate Raman peaks out here. We know the assignment and everything, that's not hard at all. I should also note, if you look in the CH stretching region, there's very little in that region suggesting these are mostly sodium chloride. I have a map of the particle in terms of a compositional map, and that's the particle. I know it's hard to see, and I apologize for that. Then we have another set of particles that exhibit extremely low reactivity. In fact, you can hardly see anything in the most intense peak due to the symmetric stretch of the nitrate ion over here, but instead you see very large intensity in the CH stretching region. So clearly that particle has a lot of organics associated with it, and the reactivity is shut down. So again, when we go think about those simple models where every particle reacts like sodium chloride, we see that that would not work very well at all here. And then we have a set of particles that exhibit what I call intermediate reactivity. You see some intensity in that CH stretching region, but you also see that some of it has reacted with nitrate. When we look at the elemental maps, we're seeing again some phase segregation. Here's the organics, here's the nitrate. We put that together, and here is the particle. So very interesting chemistry is going on. It's very much dependent on a particle by particle level. However, we're able to group these particles together, and we're trying to come up, like I said, with some information to give these modelers so that they can better represent the sea spray aerosol in the atmosphere. Okay, just one more slide, and then I'll wrap up. Kim mentioned this also in her talk. We can use microscopy. This is EDX elemental mapping. We see that particles have a ring of magnesium on the outside, maybe associated with organics. Here we might have just a few organics, and we react with nitric acid. And if you look at the color coding, we see that after reaction, we have a change in the cation distribution within the particle. So we're trying to understand this better. These types of measurements were done under vacuum, and what I would say is now we would like to do some ambient pressure measurements to understand how this cation redistribution occurs when you have this kind of chemistry going on, but in this complex system where you also have calcium, you also have magnesium, you have other elements as well. Okay, so I'll just end by saying I think we can learn a lot from studies using single particle methods. I hope I've convinced you that's the way to go. I hope I convinced you that by doing these experiments, you can really inform atmospheric chemistry models and also climate models as well. Some of the new things we're doing is looking at some spatial heterogeneity in these reactive particles, because also that's going to be important as well. Okay, and I'll just end by thanking my colleagues working with Sea Spray Aerosol, and I'm just basically mentioning the work of most of the people whose data I've shown today. As Kim showed, there's a large team involved. Kim and Tim Bertram have done a great job in starting this center, and it's a really enjoyable thing to be part of, because you can really do some interesting chemistry and some interesting studies on a very important problem. And then the mineral dust aerosol work has been work that I've been doing in my lab at the University of Iowa. And thank you for listening. Yeah, so there's a lot of interest in coal fly ash right now for a number of reasons. Some have to do with the fact of the TVA disaster that happened several years ago, when you thought you contained it, but then you did not. And then there's a lot of coal fly ash coming out from China, making its way throughout the world. And so there's some regulation, but it's still out there. And so that's something that we've been looking at with people in actually internal medicine in the College of Medicine, and some of the health effects associated with fly ash. I don't have numbers for you right now, but it's not regulated everywhere, is what I'll say. Yeah, that's a really good question. We have focused our attention on iron, okay? And iron is an abundant transition metal. With respect to copper, I will tell you I've read two really interesting papers. One had to do with copper in dust sources making its way into the oceans and being toxic because the amount of copper that was getting in, more than a nutrient. That was published in PNAS a few years ago. And there's some more recent work, modeling work, looking at copper and iron in aerosols and understanding the thermodynamics of that and why iron 2 might be not converted to iron 3 as readily because of sacrificial copper or something to that extent, copper 1, copper 2 chemistry. Not a lot. That's what I know. Does anybody know anything else? So that's the most we know in the room.
I noticed with the CH stretching region that you're trying to model with glycine, is there a reason? It's just one amino acid, so I'm just wondering.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so that was the start of trying to build up a flat top, if you will, CH stretching region. And right now, we're working to get much more information than what we did in that initial paper to understand the organics. Amino acids, carbohydrates, carboxylic acids, and we're working with a number of people to get, sort of more molecular identification of the organics, and we can go back and analyze the Raman. Again, I mentioned already that the Raman spectra can actually change over the course of a bloom in terms of at the individual particle level, and getting some more even bulk mass spectra analysis can inform the single particle data, and that's where we're going. So it was just one, but we could have picked another one. It just seemed to be an important one that we wanted to start with, and that's where we started. More recently, I don't know. I'll get back. I'll find you and get back to you on that. But it's a good question.
That undergo strong reactivity and particles and also scale of those reactions.
Yeah, in the atmosphere or in the lab? In the lab, we're doing aqueous phase chemistry. It's very fast. Okay, minutes. We didn't look at the kinetics. We looked sort of at the products. But our work was informed, and has always been, by the work of Kim Prather's group, where they see organic acids associated with particles that have been through clouds. So we wanted to get a better understanding of that chemistry, and I'm not sure of the time frame in the atmosphere. She's told me it goes into a cloud, it comes out of a cloud, it's changed. She can always tell when it's been in a cloud. And so that's where some of the information we have received in terms of from the atmospherics perspective. Okay. All right. And you have yours on here?